Hey guys, welcome back to Fix It Friday. So this week we're going to be revisiting the original Microsoft Xbox. And so with this particular unit, I'm going to be preparing it for an Xbox HDMI mod. And I've done a video of that already. You guys can check it out in the link provided below. But today what I'm going to do is first get this thing properly working again. So this Xbox has a problem that you'll see in many Xboxes, which is that the front panel buttons don't work right. So like maybe the eject button works, maybe the power button works, but this one, the power button does absolutely nothing. So the only way you can turn this system on is to literally disconnect it. So if you do this, you power it off, and then you have to literally plug it back in to turn it on again. This is a problem you'll see. It's actually fairly common. So we're going to go through, I'll show you guys how to diagnose it and fix it. And then at the end, we're going to install an Open Xenium Modchip because that's something that really makes things much better when you're doing an Xbox HDMI. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to be doing is taking this thing apart. And I've discussed this briefly before, but you need a Torx screwdriver bit for this. You have two different sizes. There's a larger bit, which you need for the 6 screws on the outside. 2 of them are hidden underneath labels, and so you can either cut open the labels or you can peel them back if you feel like it. Personally, the owner of this didn't particularly care, so I just cut a hole and made it easier to get the screws out. So once you get that out, you've got 3 screws that are also Torx. There's one located here, and then there's 2 deep down here that you need to remove. That requires the smaller Torx bit. And then from there, you've got your hard drive and your DVD drive. And you're going to need to pull these out. So we're going to go ahead and do that. This just kind of swings out like this. And this guy, you just have to remove the power cable. And you also have to remove the 40-pin connector, the IDE connector. Okay, just like that. So now we're going to go ahead and zoom in and I'll show you how to keep disassembling the rest of the system. Okay, so now that the DVD drive and the hard drive are out of the way, we're going to need to remove the actual motherboard itself. It's really not that complicated. You just need to use the same Torx screwdriver, and all the screws are in these areas where this little metal halo is, as it were. So that makes it really easy. You can find them without too much difficulty. There's also 2 over here on the AV port, so that's probably the only exception. So once that's done, I mean, this thing does kind of feel a lot like opening up a PC. So, you've got your power cable right here. That just needs to come out. If you've got a row of 2 like this, and if you have a focus encoder chip, then that tells you that this is a 1.4 version of the Xbox. So normally you're going to be working with 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and then sometimes 1.6, but people are generally not interested in modding 1.6s. Okay, so we've just disconnected all the cables, and that's basically all there is to it. At this point, we just need to pull out the motherboard, and then we're going to have a closer look at the traces on the inside and see what's going on. Alright, so now we're back, and I have flipped the motherboard over so that we're now looking at the underside of the motherboard. And so what you're seeing here is that there are, I think, 4 or 5 traces that run right along the edge of the motherboard. This is corresponding to the front, so like right here, this is where the controller ports are. So this is the front of the motherboard. And this is the area where the traces get corroded as a function of time. So it's not entirely clear what causes this. I think it's some kind of manufacturing defect with the PCB itself. It's not like this trace corrosion happens because of something that the user does or because of like rust or something like that. It's just that certain Xboxes have this problem, and it just happens after a certain period of time. And I can tell just by looking at the board that there are 2 cases of these traces that are cut. So I'm not sure if this is showing up on camera, but one of the traces right here is cut, and you can see there's a little bit of discoloration right at the edge of my fingertip. And then right over here, there's a much larger one, and this is the top trace that has been cut. And you can just see that discoloration here again. So all that we really have to do is follow these traces and basically make a patch from the nearest point from point A to point B so that we can bypass the damage and get this thing running properly again. So what I'm going to do is take a set of photographs and zoom in so you guys can see kind of where we're going to be patching. But but basically it's going to be in this region right over here.
Okay, so what we have here are zoomed in shots of the damage on the motherboard. And so what I'm going to do is just refer to this outermost trace that's closest to the edge as trace number 1. And then over here, this is trace number 2. So these are the two that we have that are damaged. All right, so now all we have to do is just find 2 points that are on this trace to bypass the damage. So if you look at the underside of the motherboard, there are 2 pads that I have labeled here, and these correspond to traces 1 and 2. So that's 1 point where we can solder a wire to bypass the damage. Now, if you follow the trace, it eventually goes onto the other side of the motherboard, and it terminates on these 2 resistors here that I have labeled as number 1 and number 2. So basically, all we've got to do is just run some very long Kynar wire going from these resistors to those pads, and that should take care of our problem.
Okay, so the first one I'm going to connect is the top trace, and that corresponds to this pad right here. So I've already tinned my wire, and it's big, but that's okay. Okay, so I also ran the wire for trace number 2. This is the one that's a little closer to the inner portion of the motherboard, and so it is going to go to this top resistor here, so it made sense to start with that one first, and then I'm going to go ahead and cut this one down to size and solder that one in as well. So what I'm doing is I'm just using my forceps to hold everything down, because otherwise it's really tough, and using some flux just like before, and everything is tinned, so it should just be a matter of just pushing them together, and there we go. Okay, so our patch wires are now installed, and so what we're going to do now is just do a quick continuity test with the multimeter and see if we've done this right. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is just touch one end of this wire here, and then I'm going to touch one of these vias and see if we've got a connection. There we go. It's hard because these are very tiny holes. Like, the vias are really small, so it's not easy to get the... Yeah, there we go. Okay, so we've got a connection here, and so that's good. All right, so now let's go ahead, reassemble the Xbox, and see if we fix the problem. Okay, so we're already off to a really good start, because when I plugged the power cord into the Xbox, it did not turn on. So let's see if I blew anything up. Let's hit the power button. Power button works. So looks like we got our trace corrosion issue fixed. So now the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take the Xbox apart again, and this time we're going to install an Open Xenium chip so that we can continue with the Xbox HDMI installation. Okay, so now that we've repaired this Xbox, the next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and install the Open Xenium chip. This mod chip is not mandatory for an Xbox HDMI install, but it does do quite a lot of nice things for you. One is that you can use any kind of hard drive that you want. It doesn't have to be locked to this specific motherboard. It can be just you know, have everything that it needs in order to run, like the firmware and all that, and you're good to go. So that also lets you use larger drives without any issues. It also means that I can remove the clock capacitor, which that's probably gone bad on this motherboard, so it'll be nice to just get rid of that anyway. It won't be necessary anymore. But in the context of the Xbox HDMI, it's going to be used to force 480p on everything. So that makes things just a little bit nicer when you're using the Xbox HDMI. Okay, so in order to install this, what I've done is I have a double row of headers that was supplied with this kit. And you can see I've pulled out one pin, and that's because if you look over here, we're going to be installing it over here in this space, and one of the pins is actually missing here, so you have to get rid of that. Now, depending on the Xbox motherboard revision you have, there may be solder in these vias or not. In this particular case, it was already open, so that makes my job a little bit easier. So I find that the easiest way to install this is just to put the headers into the Open Xenium already, and then we're just going to go right ahead and insert it into place and install it. So you'll see that I'm putting it into most of these vias, but the top two ones are going to be left unpopulated, so that's just going to be left alone. So let's go ahead and solder everything into place. Okay, so the last thing that we need to do is solder a connection to a point called D0 on the motherboard. So you can see here I've highlighted it so that it's easy for you guys to see where I'm going to be doing the soldering. So it's just a simple wire going from this point to a pad on the Open Xenium. And just like before, we're going to be using Kynar wire because it's small and it fits perfectly. Okay, so I finished the installation and reassembled the Xbox enough to just do a quick little test. So let's see how this thing looks, and hopefully the Open Xenium is installed correctly. Okay, that looks good. This is what's supposed to happen. So normally on the first boot, you'll go straight into the Open Xenium menu here. And there's a variety of different options you have available. So the one that's relevant for what we're going to be doing is that you can boot the system with a patched BIOS. And so I'm going to put a patched BIOS on here that forces everything to be in progressive mode so we don't have interlaced anymore. And that's going to make things just look way better with the Xbox HDMI. There's a whole bunch of other options in here that we could go into, but it's really kind of outside of the scope of this video. But mainly what I wanted to do was show you how to fix Xboxes when they have trace repair issues, and how to install one of these chips, because it's really important to do this for a variety of different reasons. I mean, even if you're not planning on modifying your Xbox in any way, it makes it so that if your original hard drive dies, you don't have to worry about the system being dead. You can just install any hard drive of your choice. Okay, so that's it for this video. If you guys like this content, then consider subscribing to the channel. I have videos out like this every Friday, and then if you have any consoles that you need repaired or modified, you can always contact me directly at oneuprestorations.com. Thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.